The autumn wind in Bitter Creek Gorge didn't carry golden leaves. It carried red dust, a biting cold, and people with no way out. 3 miles from town, if Mary Vale turned around, she would only see the inn door slammed shut. Her luggage confiscated. Home lost. Father lost. Everything lost. All she had left in the world was a small cloth bag and a crumpled letter from her father, who had died of a fever. And now she was walking toward Luke Ward, a lonely, scarred man who had narrowly survived the gunfire of a gang of underground robbers. A man who owned a vast ranch, yet believed he could never protect anything in this world. Luke's hand, closing the fence, froze in midair. He recognized those eyes, the eyes of Thomas Vale, the man who had carried him across the canyon with a blood-stained shoulder 8 years earlier. The girl standing before him was shivering from the frost, her boots worn, but her back was straight. She didn't cry, and absolutely didn't utter a plea. She simply held out a piece of paper to the most fearsome man in the region. Her father's dying words. "There are debts that cannot be repaid with money, Luke. It must be repaid by keeping an innocent person in a place to stand." Luke carefully tucked the paper into his shirt pocket, his cold gray eyes fixed on Mary. "Your father said that if you had nowhere else to go, you should seek out the man who owed him a life," he growled. "What else did he say?" Mary lifted her chin. Her gaze was sharp, cutting through the biting wind. "He said you needed a wife." Inside the wooden walls of Ward Mesa Ranch, poverty was evident through every crack, but there was absolutely no disorder. A folding bed, a few nearly empty sacks of flour, and neatly coiled reins hanging. Luke said nothing. He picked up the dark tin kettle, poured a strong cup of coffee, and pushed it toward Mary. The silence was suffocating. He watched the woman clutching the coffee cup with her icy hands. She might be exhausted, but her eyes were still as sharp as shards of glass. "I don't need pity." Luke's voice was low and hoarse, breaking the silence. "This ranch is too much for a man, let alone a woman. I need someone who knows how to keep this place from falling into ruin." Mary didn't flinch. The vulnerability of a homeless person recoiled, giving way to the resilience of a daughter who had followed her father through dozens of harsh settlements. "I didn't come here to beg for pity either," she replied, each word clear and distinct. "I know how to calculate hay, count flour, negotiate prices, and read contracts. I didn't come here to be fed." Luke nodded. A silent respect flickered in the lonely man's eyes. He proposed a deal, a civil marriage before the law. No lavish wedding, no false vows. Mary will have her own room, a legal status on this land, and no emotional obligations beyond respect. Mary looked him straight in the eye. "What if people say I married you because I had no other choice?" Luke turned his face to the window, where darkness was engulfing the canyon. "Then we'll show them that you chose to stay as someone with rights, not as someone who was picked up." The next morning, frost still clung to the cobwebs. 2 strangers sat side by side on the wooden bench of the carriage, facing the town of Bitter Creek. Luke had shaved his beard and wore his best worn-out coat. Mary donned a dark gray dress, her finest possession, the last remaining inheritance from her late mother. The folds of the dress were smoothed, like a shield protecting her dignity. The ceremony took place in a cramped room behind the territory's land office. Sheriff Sam Briggs stood with his arms crossed, witnessing the event. A coachman happened to pass by, signing his name haphazardly in exchange for a free cup of coffee. 9 minutes. No flowers, no music. The lives of two wounded souls were bound together by a few drops of cheap ink. As they stepped out of the building, the town's whispers began to buzz like a swarm of bees. People murmured about the lone wolf who had taken on such a burden, about the wretched girl clinging to a straw for survival. But standing on the steps of the department store, one man didn't smile. Gideon Pike. The cattle rancher, wearing an expensive sweater, took a long drag on his cigar, his cold gaze fixed on Mary's straight back as she boarded the carriage. Pike understood the laws of the West. He could easily crush or drive a lone man away, but a family was different. It took root in this land. He turned to his henchman, Roy Tully, standing beside him, exhaling a plume of gray smoke. A woman in the house doesn't make the land stronger. It only gives us another weakness to break. Love never blossoms overnight in this harsh desert. It's not sworn with flowery words under the moonlight. At Ward Mesa Ranch, bonds are sown through sweat, dust, and perseverance. The first few weeks passed in cautious silence. Luke worked from the time the frost still clung to the barbed wire fence. He chopped wood, reinforced the water troughs, and patrolled the boundary mounds with the vigilance of a hunted animal. Meanwhile, Mary didn't retreat to a corner. She began to restore order to a place that was merely there to exist, transforming it into a home. She carefully sorted each handful of beans, meticulously measured each grain of salt. She weighed the meager amount of flour and calculated the exact amount of hay needed so the horses wouldn't freeze to death when the snowstorm arrived. She recorded everything in a worn-out notebook. That weekend, the Ward family's wagon entered town to buy supplies. While Luke hunched over carrying heavy sacks of wheat to the parking lot, Mary, carrying his ledger, walked straight into the general store. Standing at the counter, she calmly flipped through the ledger. In a polite but razor-sharp voice, Mary pointed directly at the two debts for nails and kerosene that the old shopkeeper had secretly added up twice the previous month. The shopkeeper stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. He hastily erased the unreasonable amount with an eraser, not daring to look up at her. For the first time, the townspeople looked at Mary not with pity for a homeless person, but as a woman who truly headed the household. Luke leaned against the shop doorframe, witnessing the whole scene. He could have easily stormed in and threatened the shopkeeper, but he didn't. He folded his arms, letting her take control. That was the deepest respect he could offer. That night, the wind was bitterly cold. Mary stepped out onto the porch, her cloak billowing. She saw Luke lighting a rolled cigarette, his gray eyes fixed on Bitter Creek Gap, the narrow gorge that blocked their border just north of their property. Gideon Pike won't stop just because you know how to settle accounts, Luke murmured, exhaling a thin wisp of smoke into the darkness. Mary stepped closer, standing beside him, her gaze fixed on the gorge. Then I'll learn what he's hiding in those legal papers. 3 days later, the darkness of the West had truly arrived. A sleek black carriage, completely out of place in the dusty red landscape, screeched to a halt in front of Ward Mesa Ranch. Gideon Pike stepped out. He was dressed like an East Coast nobleman, but his shrewd glances were those of a hyena. Following closely behind him was Roy Tully, his henchman with the dull eyes and his hand always resting on the butt of his rifle. Pike tipped his hat, offering a sickeningly polite, artificial smile. But every word he uttered carried a heavy weight. He got straight to the point. He offered to buy the northern strip of land from the ranch, the very place where Bitter Creek Gap was located. "I just need a safe passage to herd the cattle south before the blizzard hits, Luke," Pike said, his voice sweet but his eyes unblinking. "Sell it. You'll have a lot of money, enough to take your new wife to a warmer town instead of freezing to death in this remote corner." Luke stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw clenched. He flatly refused. He knew perfectly well that the canyon was their only natural shield. If they opened it, thousands of Pike's cattle would swarm through, trampling the water source and the meager hay reserves. The entire farm would be crushed. Pike's smile vanished. His polite facade crumbled. He issued a threat. He was preparing to submit a petition to the county government requesting that the gap be recognized as a public road. If the petition passed, Luke's fence would be legally removed. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, Mary emerged from the cabin. She wiped the flour from her hands on her apron and looked directly into the eyes of the cattle tyrant. "Mr. Pike," Mary's voice was clear and sharp, "which land survey proves what you just said? On what basis do you claim to convert private land into a public road?" Pike paused, his bushy eyebrows furrowed. He was unaccustomed to being questioned about the law by a frail woman in this barren land. He cleared his throat, reluctantly uttering a name. The file lay on Alden Cross's desk, the land clerk. He turned and walked toward the carriage, but abruptly stopped, moving closer to Mary. "You can read, Mrs. Ward. That's a good skill," Pike whispered, his voice hissing through clenched teeth like a venomous snake. "But in this territory, the survivor isn't the one who can read the law." He smirked, glancing at Luke before concluding, "The one who has enough cattle to make the law obey." Gideon Pike's threats were never just empty words. The following morning, before the thick fog had even lifted from the valley, Luke was patrolling the northern border with his rifle. He stopped. 3 rows of barbed wire stretched across the gorge had been cleanly cut by bolt cutters. The fence was breached. Dozens of hoof prints had churned up the stored hay. Worse still, the small winter vegetable patch that Mary had painstakingly sown and watered for the past 2 weeks was now a muddy, soggy mess, crushed by the hooves of the cattle. Luke knelt on one knee on the cold ground, carefully tracing the deep boot tracks that stretched to the rocky crevice. He recognized the distinctive star-shaped spur pattern. Roy Tully's mark. A soft sound came from behind. Mary was standing there, staring intently at the ruined vegetable patch. That was their only source of fresh food for the harsh winter ahead. Most women would cry or collapse in despair, but Mary didn't. The women who survived on this border had no time for tears. She bit her lip, pulled a small notebook from her apron, calmly observed, and began to take notes. Luke frowned at her, his voice tinged with astonishment. "What are you doing?" "Recording the damage," Mary replied, her eyes fixed on the page. How many feet of fence were cut? How many inches of grass were destroyed? How many days' labor went to this vegetable patch? If we don't record it on paper with precise numbers, the authorities will say nothing happened. Luke stood speechless. The icy wall in the lonely man's heart cracked once more before the radiant resilience of his contracted wife. He bent down and picked a small piece of leather from the barbed wire. It had been torn from the intruder's horsewhipping cord. Luke clutched the piece of leather tightly in his hand, his voice strained. "Roy Tully." Mary slammed the notebook shut, her eyes sharp. "Then tomorrow, I'll go to the land office." Before entering the legal battle, Mary asked Luke to stop the carriage in front of the Bitter Creek Inn. She needed to retrieve her confiscated suitcase. The innkeeper's bossy landlady was trying to make things difficult, demanding an unreasonable storage fee. Luke frowned, intending to toss a silver dollar on the table to end the trouble, but Mary stopped him. She opened the ledger, coldly pointing out the incorrectly charged fee, and only paid the last few coins she had left. She wouldn't allow anyone to take away even a single penny that belonged to her dignity. Upon returning to the carriage, Mary hastily tore open the suitcase. Beneath her worn clothes, she pulled out the most important memento, her father's leather-bound notebook. Thomas Vale had worked as a surveying assistant for the government. Tucked between the dense pages of notes was a fragment of an old, hand-drawn survey map. Mary smoothed the delicate paper. Her heart pounded. Her father had personally marked the boundaries of Bitter Creek Gap. On this original drawing, a row of dead cotton trees in a limestone reef were designated as the natural boundary north of Ward Mesa Ranch. Thomas's note clearly stated, this gorge was entirely private land, not on a public grazing route. The couple immediately took the map to the land office to see Alden Cross, the territorial secretary. But when Cross, sweating profusely and trembling, pulled out the current land registry ledger to compare, everything had changed. The boundary line on the official government map had been deliberately erased and shifted dozens of yards south. The dead cotton trees had disappeared, replaced by the symbol for Old Dry Road. According to this fraudulent record, Bitter Creek Gap had fallen into a gray area, a completely unclaimed piece of land that Gideon Pike could have proposed for a public road. Stepping out of the building into the harsh Arizona sun, the story's objective was completely reversed. They weren't just facing winter, they were facing an organized land grab. They had to prove that someone had used Thomas Vale's death to falsify the entire land registry. Mary stood still, her fingers tracing her father's familiar, trembling handwriting in the notebook. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of weakness. My father didn't send me here just to be rescued by you, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Luke looked at her, his gaze carrying a profound understanding. Then, why did he send you? Mary looked up at her man, her eyes blazing with unwavering determination. To save you from the robbery he didn't manage to stop. Mary immediately sent a complaint letter to the Territorial Land Office, requesting a copy and comparison of the original map. But Gideon Pike's power in Bitter Creek moved much faster than a mail carriage. The invisible noose began to tighten, not with guns and bullets, but with stomachs. When Luke drove to the general store to load flour and beans, the shopkeeper looked away, resolutely shaking his head. He hid the sacks of food under the counter, muttering an excuse that Ward Mesa's old debt was not yet paid, and therefore he couldn't sell on credit. On the way back, the neighbor who had promised to sell half of Luke's haystock hastily closed his gate, apologizing that he had already signed a contract to buy the entire stock from the Pike family. Gideon Pike didn't need to fire a single bullet. He's locking Ward Mesa Ranch on a deserted island, leaving them to freeze and starve to death before the first snowstorm of the season hits. They needed money. Money to pay the expensive legal document copying fees, and money to buy food on the black market. Without a word of complaint, that afternoon, Mary quietly walked to the pawn shop at the end of the street. She took out from her pocket a sparkling silver brooch, the last, only memento left of her late mother. Luke happened to follow her and witnessed it. The hardened man's heart felt as if it were being squeezed by an invisible hand. He hurried forward, placing his large, rough hand on hers, intending to take the brooch back. "Don't," Luke whispered, his voice hoarse. I'll find another way. But Mary slowly pulled her hand away. Her gaze was firm, fixed on him. If I cling to memories and lose our future, our parents will never forgive me. Luke released her hand. The pain gave way to profound respect. He realized that this woman had truly rooted her life in his barren land. As night fell, the temperature plummeted below freezing. Luke donned his coat, picked up his lantern, and went out to patrol the stables as usual. Suddenly, the horses in the stable sneezed and recoiled, stamping their hooves in unease. Luke raised his lantern. A biting north wind lashed across his face, not carrying the familiar sagebrush scent of the desert, but a disgusting odor that sent a chill down his spine. The smell of chemicals, the smell of kerosene. The eastern hayshed was ablaze. The bright red flames licked at the resin-soaked wooden walls, illuminating the dark mesa. Luke dropped his hurricane lamp, let out a loud yell, and charged madly toward the stables. He hammered through the smoking door, blindfolded himself, and dragged the horses, frantically running for their lives, out. Just seconds later, Mary rushed from the main house. In her hands were soaking wet blankets and 2 buckets of ice-cold water. The wind lashed the scorching flames against their faces, burning the strands of hair on their foreheads. A panicked horse recoiled, its legs striking a broken stake, and it neighed in pain, collapsing into the mud. Mary threw the bucket of water against the wooden wall to prevent the fire from spreading to the main house. Then, without hesitation, plunged into the thick smoke to protect the injured horse. 2 people wrestled with death until dawn. The main house and the horses were saved, but the entire hay storage, Ward Mesa's lifeline for this winter, had been reduced to a pile of black, smoking ashes. Mary knelt on the muddy ground, her hands blistered and bleeding from carrying cold water, constantly stroking and comforting the horse whose leg had been pierced. Her face was smeared with soot, but not a single sob escaped her lips. Luke sifted through the acrid-smelling rubble. Beneath a layer of ash, he unearthed an empty tin can embossed with the Pike family's exclusive shipping mark. Around the edge of the fence, clearly imprinted on the thin layer of freshly fallen snow, were a series of sharp, star-shaped hoof prints. Roy Tully had been here. The legal battle has now officially become a bloody fight for survival. As the pale sun rose, a strange horseman galloped across the edge of Ward Mesa. He didn't stop, but swung his hand, throwing a hunting knife that pinned an envelope to a fence post in front of the house. Luke stepped forward and snatched the envelope. It was an ultimatum from Gideon Pike. On the pristine white paper was a cold, sharp black inscription. Sell Bitter Creek Gap within 48 hours, or a land reclamation petition will be filed before the first snowstorm blocks all your escape routes. Gideon Pike's ultimatum lay haphazardly on the wooden table. The letter was accompanied by a bank draft. That amount was more than enough to pay off all of Ward Mesa's debts. It was enough for Luke to get Mary on a safe train ride, leave this hellish Bitter Creek, buy a small house in a bustling town, and live peacefully for the rest of his life. Luke buried his head in his hands, stained with dust and ash. The man who had once faced the guns of the underground gang without batting an eye was now trembling. He wasn't afraid of losing his land. He was afraid history would repeat itself. He was afraid the woman diligently bandaging the horse outside would lose her life because of him. When Mary entered, her eyes fell upon the promissory note. She looked at Luke's broad shoulders, now slumped, and she understood immediately. This man was about to surrender. She didn't yell or reproach him. She walked over and placed her hand, stained with blood from carrying water, on his shoulder. "If you sell this place because you're afraid for me," Mary said slowly, each word clearly audible in the silent space, "Pike isn't just taking the land. He's going to steal the man your father entrusted his life to." Luke looked up, his gray eyes filled with pain and torment. "For 8 years, I've just been living a mere existence. I didn't dare want more, didn't dare love anything, because anything I held on to was ultimately taken away." Mary knelt down to his eye level, gazing intently into his broken soul. "A home isn't a place without danger, Luke. A home is where two people choose to stand together when the storm comes." Luke's eyes darkened, pausing for a second, then suddenly blazed with the fire of unwavering determination. He had made his choice. He wouldn't sell. But he wouldn't seek a bloody resolution either. Luke stood up straight, unfastening the leather belt from his hip, removing the old Colt pistol that had been his constant companion for 8 years. He slammed the gun down on the table, pushing the promissory note aside. "If we use this for revenge," Luke growled, pointing at the gun, "Pike will prove to the whole town that I'm just a bloodthirsty gangster. He'll be right." Mary smiled, the most radiant smile Luke had seen since she arrived in this land. "Then we'll win against him with the truth." The next morning, the counterattack officially began on both fronts. In the field, Luke rode his horse, following the tracks left by the kerosene truck the previous night. He followed the deep ruts in the mud, making his way to a deserted annex of the Pike family's camp hidden behind red cliffs. There, he encountered Roy Tully. There were no loud gunfights. A short, brutal, but silent skirmish ensued. Using his survival skills as a former scout, Luke easily disarmed Roy, throwing the henchman to the dusty ground. Luke held the blade to Roy's neck. The henchman closed his eyes, awaiting death. But Luke didn't kill him. He coldly cut a piece of leather from Roy's spur, picked up the empty kerosene can as evidence, and turned his back, leaving his enemy trembling in fear. Meanwhile, at the land office, Mary was launching a devastating intellectual attack. Setting her father's notebook beside the latest survey map, she forced Secretary Alden Cross to remain seated. With her keen eyes, Mary pointed out 3 undeniable anomalies. "Mr. Cross, look closely." Mary tapped her finger on the paper. "First, the natural rock boundary has been drawn 2 compass degrees off. Second, the dead cotton trees have been erased, brazenly renamed Old Dry Road to mislead the topographical concept." She turned to the last page, leaning her face close to the sweating secretary. "And most importantly, the witness's signature on the new map shows signs of being pressed down. This is a forged signature." Alden Cross's face turned pale. He avoided Mary's sharp gaze. The legal battle seemed to have been completely broken from within by Mary. But Gideon Pike was never one to be easily defeated by a few papers. Mary stepped out of the land office, a fleeting sense of triumph running through her veins. But her smile froze instantly. Standing across the street, leaning against the wooden porch post of the pub, was Roy Tully. He didn't look like someone who had just been defeated. He stared directly at Mary, a sinister smile on his face, casually tossing a glittering object back and forth in his hand. Mary's heart sank. In the sunlight, the object gleamed brilliantly. It was her mother's silver brooch, the item she had pawned yesterday to get money to save the farm. Gideon Pike had redeemed it, not as a favor, but to send a cruel message. They could lay their hands on anything she held most precious. Gideon Pike's warning was clear. He could get his hands on anything Mary held most precious. Holding her mother's memento in the hands of her enemy, Mary understood the rules had changed. She took her suspicions about the forged signature to Sheriff Sam Briggs. He was an upright man, but his badge was bound by rigid territorial laws. Sam Briggs shook his head, his face a picture of helplessness. "I need direct testimony or irrefutable physical evidence directly linking to Pike. A redeemed silver brooch and a few suspicious ink marks aren't enough to arrest the county's highest taxpayer, Mary." Not stopping there, Pike delivered the knockout blow. Leveraging his connections with the authorities, he expedited the hearing to recognize the road through Bitter Creek Gap to the following morning. Their plan was on the verge of complete collapse. That night, Luke decided to gamble. He saddled his horse and rode through the night, traversing 10 miles of jagged, rocky terrain to find the last witness, an old former surveyor who had worked with Thomas Vale, the only one who could confirm the original handwriting. But he underestimated the ruthlessness of the pikeman's henchmen. On the way back, as dawn approached, Luke's wagon axle, which someone had secretly chipped off beforehand, broke in on a narrow incline. The wagon overturned. Luke was thrown into a shallow ravine, his shoulder striking a red rock. Dust billowed. His shoulder was torn, warm blood gushing out and staining his worn woolen coat red. No horse, no wagon. From there to town was a 3-mile walk with a dislocated shoulder. The pale sun peeked over the mesa. The hearing began in the large hall of Bitter Creek Town Hall. Luke hadn't arrived yet. Mary was without her only support. She entered the room, reeking of cigar smoke and the sweat of rough men. Pike sat comfortably in the front row, legs crossed, a smug smile of someone who had already secured victory. Several small ranchers bowed their heads to the floor, silent for fear of losing the deal. Secretary Alden Cross nervously smoothed the petition, preparing to stamp it. "Does anyone have the authority to object to this road construction?" the presiding officer asked perfunctorily, his eyes scanning the evasive faces. The room was filled with cowardly complicity. Pike smirked, reaching to adjust his collar. Then, the sound of a wooden chair sliding backward shattered the silence. Mary Vale stood up straight. Her back was as proud as a pine tree on a cliff. In her hand was her late father's worn-out notebook. "I object." Her voice rang out, clear, sharp, and without a trace of tremor. Gideon Pike laughed mockingly, his deep voice echoing throughout the room. A newlywed woman, perhaps not even able to distinguish between a cow and a horse, wants to teach the men here about land law? But Mary didn't back down. She strode straight to the chairman's table, flipped through Thomas Vale's original notebook, and slammed it down beside the new survey map. With astonishingly precise cadastral terminology, she exposed the lie. "Look at the slope of this drawing," Mary said sharply, pointing to the creases in the paper. "Your map misrepresents the depth of Bitter Creek. It depicts a dead row of cotton plants as a shallow body of water. It's something imagined by someone sitting in a warm room, drawn with fake ink, not the record of someone who has sweated over surveying this land." She spun around, staring intensely at Alden Cross and Gideon Pike. "I may not own thousands of cattle like you, Mr. Pike, but I know how to read a lie when it brazenly steals the work of others." Under pressure from the overwhelmingly logical evidence, Secretary Alden Cross began to stammer.
He inadvertently revealed that the map had been submitted and stamped after Thomas Vale's death.
Exposed in front of the crowd, Pike flew into a rage. He slammed his hand on the table, intending to roar and summon the bribed witnesses to distort the truth. But before he could open his mouth, the door to the hearing room was kicked open. Luke Ward entered. His clothes were tattered and covered in red dust. The left shoulder of his coat was soaked with dark blood, but his gray eyes shone brightly and coldly like a hunting knife. Following closely behind him was Sheriff Sam Briggs, and escorted by him, his hands bound with iron handcuffs, his face bruised and battered with fear, was Roy Tully. Luke stepped up to the judge's table. With his other hand, he forcefully tossed the kerosene can bearing the Pike Shop logo, the broken piece of leather cord, and the star-shaped spur onto the wooden table. Sheriff Briggs' deep voice boomed. "Roy Tully has confessed everything, Your Honor. He admitted to sawing off the wagon axles and burning the hay storehouse because he feared Pike would make him the scapegoat for arson. The truth was laid bare. Physical evidence perfectly matched the paperwork. The lies were shattered." The judge's face turned pale. He immediately ordered the road construction proposal suspended, all land records sealed, and ordered Sheriff Briggs to investigate Pike's network. Cornered, his empire crumbling before his eyes, Pike raged like a bloodthirsty beast. He turned to hurl insults at Mary and mocked the death of Thomas Vale. Luke's calloused hands clenched into fists. His knuckles cracked. He could have easily smashed the man's jaw or strangled him right there, but Luke chose to stand still. He wrapped his uninjured arm around Mary's shoulder, pulling her into his embrace with absolute pride. Violence is the last weapon of the fearful, and he needed no fear anymore, for he had it all. As he was handcuffed and led away by the police, Pike snarled through clenched teeth, "You only got lucky winning a piece of barren land, Luke." Luke looked straight into the eyes of the crumbling tyrant, his calm voice echoing through the room. "No, I kept a home." A few weeks after the hearing concluded, winter truly descended upon Bitter Creek. Ward Mesa Ranch was still a poor place. The burned-down barn would take months, even a year, to rebuild completely. The injured horse limped in the manger, but it was resilient enough to survive. The couple still had a debt for supplies at the grocery store. But one thing had changed forever. Bitter Creek Gap wasn't robbed, and the small farmers around the area had begun to hold their heads high, realizing that greedy mob bosses like Gideon Pike weren't invincible. One cold but sun-drenched morning, Luke stepped out onto the porch. He approached Mary, carefully placing a small, sparkling object in her hand. It was her mother's beaded silver brooch. He had redeemed it. Mary looked up at him in astonishment. Her gaze inadvertently fell on Luke's waist. The familiar cowhide belt was still there, but the holster was completely empty.
The old Colt pistol, the only weapon he'd kept for self-defense for the past 8 years, was gone. She understood immediately. He had sold his last blood-stained piece of his past to redeem a cherished memento for her.
There were no tearful thank yous, no dramatic hugs or vows of eternal love. Their love was forged in fiery red flames, blizzards, and silent sacrifice. Mary brought 2 steaming cups of coffee to the north fence, the exact spot where they'd first met. They leaned against each other, gazing out at Bitter Creek Gap bathed in the cold sun. Luke took a sip of coffee. The corners of the lips of the man who had never known how to smile now curved into a soft arc. "Your father said, 'I need a wife,'" Luke said thoughtfully, breaking the silence. turned to look directly into the eyes of the man of her life. A radiant, peaceful smile bloomed on her lips. "He was only wrong about one thing," Mary replied. Luke frowned slightly. "What?" "You need someone to choose to stay," Mary whispered, her breath forming a hazy smoke that lingered in the cold air. "And I, too." Luke reached out, intertwining his calloused, scratched fingers with her small but resilient hands. Their hands clasped together. No further explanation was needed. On the first day Mary arrived here, she stood on this porch with a crumpled letter and a desperate hopelessness. She was a homeless wanderer seeking refuge. But now, amidst the red wind of Bitter Creek, she was no longer someone sent to a strange farm. She is the mistress of the house, the one who fought alongside Luke Ward to keep this home. Thank you for accompanying Mary and Luke in their fight to protect their honor and what is most precious. Love sometimes doesn't begin with vows under the moonlight, but with the moment two people choose not to give up when the storm comes. If this healing story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe. We'll be back next week, bringing more heroic and romantic stories from the fiery West. See you by the warm fire.